All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Next Man Up podcast. I'm your host, Banning and Colin, and I'm my co-host with me, Colin Martin.
How's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Not bad.
All right. We got a lot to talk about, so a busy week. We'll just get into it, and we'll start off with the thing that's on everyone's mind right now, March Madness. Just to start, we are, as of this recording, we're going into the Sweet 16, and by the time this episode comes out, it'll be the start of the Sweet 16 and then the Elite Eight. So we'll just have some predictions to go over that. We did a power rankings the other day on Instagram. By the time this comes out, it'll already be out. So if we talk about that, we will, but it's already been out. So I think we'll mostly just, I guess we can just go through the bracket too to start. We can just go game by game since I think there's probably going to be some easy ones to predict. If you want to talk about the first or second round, anything that stood out first while I pull the bracket up.
Yeah. So I mean, first, second rounds, like every year, we see some crazy upsets. Obviously, what's on everyone's mind that's been talked about quite a bit is we saw the second 16th overall seed beat a one seed ever with Farley Dickinson this year. Those New Jersey schools know how to put on a March Madness. And then speaking of New Jersey, we have Princeton upset Arizona, which was a pretty big deal. I guess the theme is the teams that we might have seen as fraudulent went out even earlier than we could have anticipated, those being Purdue and Arizona. And then, we're seeing some heat from other schools, maybe schools that we were down on that have proven themselves. Schools that stand out to me are Xavier, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I was very low on them, and they've been winning. FAU they've had a pretty easy path, all things considered, but they beat Memphis, whether, you think that was fair or not at the end of the game. And then they only had to go through FDU, so they're still hanging around. And then, Michigan State has overcome a lot so far. So I think, we've seen some crazy upsets, but I also think we've seen some teams that we're getting, some flack from the media show that they belong here. So that's the biggest thing I've noticed so far.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen, especially in the first round too, like you said, I think we both, I don't know how far you had Purdue going, but I had them losing in the second round anyway. I
Yeah.
just didn't really think, especially when you have a team built basically around one player. It reminds me a lot when I was watching it of kind of that Bucks and Nets series where the Bucks were like, okay, we can't guard everyone. We're going to let KD drop 40 on us, but we're going to make the rest of the guys work. And that's exactly what they did. And they didn't really, I mean, he didn't play an amazing game overall just because it's got to the point where like Penn State almost beat them in the Big Ten championship. And watching that, a Penn State team that can get hot from three, but also isn't a complete team like we saw against Texas. They had a chance to win, but they lost. When I saw Purdue play that game close, it didn't give me much confidence in Purdue, but I was still obviously surprised to see them lose in the first round. Some other notable teams too. Obviously, Princeton had a very good first game against Arizona, but then had an even better game against Mizzou, which I think a lot of people weren't really expecting them to win that game just because most of the time we see upsets happen and then they just lose in the second round. But there's some good teams overall too that we've got to at this point. I think we only have two one seeds left, which is interesting. And I think the only bracket that's really kind of stayed, I think that Houston and Texas bracket. Obviously, Miami's in there at the 5 seed, but they beat Indiana. So I mean, they have the 1, 2, 3, and 5 seed left. So besides that, they're really the only like bracket that stayed alive relatively.
Yeah.
So just we can go over the games just to start first. We'll start. I don't really have like the it doesn't really say the East and everything on there, but we'll start I guess on the Alabama side. Alabama and San Diego State. I think this will be an interesting game. I think San Diego State is definitely a sleeper team, but I think Alabama is definitely the best team left in the tournament. So I don't think they lose this game.
Yeah. And I think San Diego State has been getting a little bit disrespected. I think they were an early pick to have an upset. Those 5 seeds always have, a lot of heat on them early on. But I'm going to agree with you here. Alabama, Brandon Miller's been playing amazing all tournament. Alabama hasn't had a real test so far. That's kind of just what comes with the 1 seed. So I think San Diego State will give them a run for their money, but I think Alabama's just a better team.
And then the next matchup in the South, we have Creighton and Princeton. I think Creighton comes out with this. I think being a 6 seed, they definitely got underseeded in my opinion. I think they're a really good team. And I think this is my only Elite Eight matchup that's still alive. I had Alabama and Creighton, and I think Creighton's going to advance.
Yeah, and just like you're saying, Creighton is a really good team, very underseeded. That they had a really bad stretch towards the middle of the season that resulted in this, but they started the season amazing, ended it amazing, and are playing great through the tournament. I think Princeton, I think we're undervaluing some of their best players. They have some really good dudes. We're gonna, see in the offseason, no matter how this tournament ends for them, they're gonna have some dudes transfer to some really good schools, and we're gonna see them shine. Like they have some dudes on that team. With that being said, Creighton is just on all fronts better. And so I'm going to agree with you and also roll with Creighton here.
And then just to end this, we have Alabama and Creighton on this side. I have Alabama. I think they're the best team in the tournament, but I do think it's going to be a close game. I think Creighton can give them a run for their money.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that sentiment right there. I feel like I could give some better insight on this, but I'll just admit my bias. I really like guards that have played for a long time, whether they be seniors or in Javon Quinterly's case, he's a fifth year. I think he's going to show out. Obviously, I've already mentioned Brandon Miller. Creighton, I think this is a great run, and it shows that they really are made for March Madness, but I do think it would stop here. I think Alabama would win this game.
And then we'll go over to the Midwest. To start, we have Houston and Miami. Miami obviously getting that big win over Indiana, Phil School. And Houston with a big win over Auburn. I think Houston comes out with this game too. I would say relatively easy. I think Miami's been good, but I think Houston's, as a 1 seed, they're a complete team.
Yeah, this is the first time we're going to disagree. Houston hasn't really shown me as much as I would have wanted to see. I think a lot of that comes with Marcus Sasser being injured and he's clearly playing through the injury. Miami has been on it. I feel like in the first round, everybody wanted the Drake upset, and everybody was saying, "Oh, but Indiana will handle them." And Miami's played like there were no expectations. I think they're playing like the underdogs. They're playing with fire, with passion. Isaiah Wong is one of the 10 best players in the country. I think this is a time he shows that he's more in that top 5 range. I think they get a win against Houston here.
I'm just more of a fan of the Miami women's basketball team, if I'm being honest.
I think we all are.
Yeah, and they also had a big upset the other night too against number 1 Indiana. And then we'll move to the other side, Xavier and Texas. I think this is going to be, honestly, like you said before, Xavier kind of being underrated at this point. But I think this is going to be a good game. And looking at this before, I had Texas winning, but I might have to go with Xavier in this instance, just because Texas, Penn State, I think if they were a more complete team overall, they had the lead with a few minutes left. If they made one of those shots, I think they definitely could have won the game. And I think a team like Xavier, who's just more complete, if they get the lead, I don't see Texas coming back from that.
Yeah, and I understand the reasoning there. You guys heard me come on the podcast last week and tell you Texas was my pick. So obviously I'm going to still roll with them here. But with that being said, I like that sentiment. But what I would argue is that Texas played one of their worst games in recent memory against Penn State. And I think we both agree Penn State is a really good team, despite having, holes. But even then, if you can have a really poor performance and still come on top of a team that debatably has the best player in the country with Jalen Pickett, that is a good look for me. I think they'll come out with more fire against Xavier.
So then I'll just go through mine quickly since we both have opposite ones. I have Houston and Xavier in my Sweet 16 matchup, or I guess this would be the Elite Eight, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I have Houston coming out of that game. I think they're still the best team in that bracket.
Yeah, and I would have Miami and Texas, which is the same matchup I had in the bracket we filled out and posted on Instagram. For me, I'm going to stick to my bracket. If my stuff's still available, it hasn't been thrown out already, I'll stick with my guns. I like Texas in that game. Miami at this point would have been going on a crazy run. But then when you start to talk about who's the more complete team, once again, my senior guard in March Madness bias comes here. I'm a big Marcus Carr supporter. I think him and Isaiah Wong would be my favorite match for the whole tournament. I would not blink while watching that game. That being said, I think Carr and Texas would get the better of Miami in this matchup.
And then we'll move over to the West. The first matchup we have UConn and Arkansas. And this is an interesting game for me. Arkansas just beat Kansas, and I don't think that was Kansas's best performance. And that's kind of what we saw in the championship game too, when they lost by 20, I think it was. And I think Kansas just kind of disappointed this season because I think they should have been almost a lock for the Final Four, especially in that bracket. But I think UConn wins this game. I think they're a lot better. Arkansas had a good run, but I think in the end, sometimes the better team just has to win.
Yeah, this was the toughest one for me. And I completely agree with what you were just saying. I think UConn is the better team. But if I'm Arkansas and I've been underrated all year, I'm peaking at the right time, and I just came off beating Kansas, who a lot of people has the best team in the tourney. I'm feeling really good about them. So I have them keeping that roll going and beating UConn, even though I would say UConn is probably the better team.
And then the final matchup, Gonzaga and UCLA. And I said this before this started. If this happened, I just don't have that much faith in UCLA. I think they're a good team, but I just don't see them getting past Gonzaga in this game.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think we've been waiting for it to be Gonzaga's year for a long time. This really might be it. They've shown that they can beat high level teams before. They've also lost to high level teams, so I can see it going either way. But I like Gonzaga as well.
So did you have UConn over Arkansas?
I had Gonzaga and Arkansas playing in this Elite Eight game.
Okay, so I have Gonzaga and UConn, and I think Gonzaga wins the game.
Yeah, I have Gonzaga and Arkansas, and to keep it simple, I also have Gonzaga winning here.
And then we'll go over to the East. When we started this March Madness talk, we said that basically whoever comes out of here we both said this was a gauntlet. This side just has so many teams that I think honestly, pretty much every team was kind of underseeded besides Purdue, obviously on this side. But like teams like Kentucky, they went far. Tennessee beating Duke, FAU and FDU. It's kind of an interesting matchup to see. But just to segue into that, now we have Tennessee and FAU. I think Tennessee wins this game over FAU. Probably a low scoring game, but Tennessee is going to lock them up.
Yeah, and as a Tennessee fan, I've tuned into a lot of their games this year. I think Tennessee's biggest weakness is guarding deep three-pointing, shooting teams, because Tennessee does not let you score on the inside. So FAU is probably it's not a very favorable matchup, I'll say. With that being said, I think Tennessee has finally figured out how to create on offense with Vescovi being locked up every single play and Ziegler being out for the rest of the year. So this is getting a little long-winded. I'm going to say Tennessee wins this game, but it's going to be really, really close.
And then the next matchup that we have on this side is Kansas State and Michigan State. And this is an interesting matchup for me, especially just because before this, I didn't really have much confidence in Michigan State. I do think Kansas State is the better team overall, and I don't think that's a hot take at all. But I just have this feeling I'm just going to go with Michigan State. I don't know why, but I feel like they're going to pull this one out.
No, I respect it. And maybe there's a little bit, I know you don't like Michigan State, but maybe a little bit of Big Ten bias in there. They're showing out for you guys. But with that being said, I mean, you alluded to it. Kansas State is the more complete team. I trust Keontae Johnson. I trust, as Coach Cal would say, the little guy at point guard. Like, their team is made up of tons of really good players. I think they just overwhelm Michigan State to a point. So I would say Kansas State.
And then for my Elite Eight matchup on this side, I have Tennessee and Michigan State. And I have basically the battle of Tennessee and Mr. March and Tom Izzo. So I think this is going to be a close game. And I think Tennessee is going to win this game. I think Michigan State's run comes to an end.
Yeah, I really appreciate the Tennessee love. I would also pick them over Michigan State. Unfortunately, I have Kansas State here, which honestly, out of all the teams left in the tournament, I think matches up the best with Tennessee. I really don't think we have an answer for the way they play offense. With that being said, I have to use my brain instead of my heart. I think when we get to a Kansas State-Tennessee matchup, Kansas State would win, and that's what I have here.
All right. So I guess as of right now, my predictions, we'll probably put a post out on this just to get it out of the way. Do you want to do the Final Four right now just to predict it?
Yeah, I mean, why not? Let's throw it out there.
All right. So I'm trying to keep track of it. So right now I have Alabama and Tennessee in my first matchup. And I think Alabama just completely overwhelms them. And I wouldn't be surprised if this happens. I think it's a 10-point, 15-point win.
See, for me, if Tennessee had got there in mind, Tennessee has proven they can beat Alabama this season already. I would love to see that matchup. I really hope it gets to that point. But for me, I have Kansas State here. And for all the same things you said Alabama would do to Tennessee, I imagine them doing to Kansas State. So I would have Alabama winning that game.
And then on my other side, I have Houston and Gonzaga at this point, and it's not it's a chalk championship game, Houston and Alabama, but I think Houston wins. And then I'll just say I think Alabama beats Houston in the championship.
Yeah. So on my other side here, started out, I have Texas versus Gonzaga. I'm going to keep my Texas thing going. You may have seen the Instagram post already. I really think Texas is one of the most well-rounded teams in the tournament. I feel like they have 5 different guys that could show out every single night. And when you come to March Madness and you're running 6 or 7 man rotations, that's all you really need. So I would take them to beat Gonzaga. And then per my same prediction as earlier, I would also have them beating Alabama. Alabama is a 1 seed, and they're the best ranked team in this whole tournament for a good reason, but they're not unbeatable. We've seen teams that, rank much lower than them, such as Tennessee, show their weaknesses this year. They go through shooting slumps. So I'm going to take Texas still.
Yeah, so that's just a brief prediction for now. We'll have to see what happens when we get to it, but I think by the next time that we talk, we will have an official Elite Eight at that point, and then we can go over that. So next, we're just going to bounce into our MLB playoff predictions, and we'll just go over this really quickly, just because it's kind of just a culmination of all the predictions that we've done so far. So it's not like we had to go digging very far for this. And just to start, I think we have pretty similar ones. So I'll just start with my AL. So my first seed, I have the Astros, and then 2, I have the Yankees. And we talked about this before off camera, but the way that the playoffs are set up is the first 2 division winners get the first 2 seeds. I just assumed that it was the first 3 since the 3 division winners get it, but I guess not. So then at 3, I have the Blue Jays, 4, I have the Guardians, 5, I have the Twins, and 6, I have the Mariners. So this would result in another Blue Jays Mariners matchup, and then I'd have the Guardians and Twins playing in the wild card game. So I think those would be interesting matchups again. Blue Jays could get their revenge, and I think the Guards and Twins would be a fun matchup to see.
Yeah, and I like those matchups right there. My first seed, I have the Astros, and I have the Yankees. Then afterwards, I would have the Guardians at 3, the Blue Jays at 4, the Mariners at 5. And this was a toss-up for me because I had 2 teams at the same record. Obviously, we can't really predict tiebreakers, so I kind of just had to pick one. So for the sake of the episode, I put the White Sox at 6. I'm not a huge White Sox believer, but with that being said, that would bring us to a matchup where we'd see, again, the Blue Jays and the Mariners matchup. I mean, that brought me a little bit of PTSD, but I would also like to see the Guardians and the White Sox matchup. I think those are kind of as good of the matchups as we're going to get. I mean, there's some other teams in the AL that are going to make pushes, such as the Rays, the Twins, even the Rangers or the Angels. But I think the top 6 or 8 teams are pretty, standard for what people predict.
Okay. And then we'll go into the NL. So my first seed was the Braves, and then at 2, I have the Dodgers. At 3, I have the Padres. 4, I have the Phillies. 5, I have the Mets. And at 6, I have the Cardinals. So this would result in a Padres-Cardinals matchup and then a Phillies-Mets matchup to start the wild card round. And as a Phillies fan, I'd love to see this just because I think the Phillies get by the Mets, and especially with their injury they had last week. I think the Phillies, we'll see how that affects the team overall, but the Mets do not look great right now.
Yeah. And that's something I couldn't really predict when we did the records, but I'm going to stick with what I had. I don't want to switch it up. So, and this, shows an example of how the division winners come into play. Because at my first seed, I'll have the Dodgers. And then second seed, I would have the Mets. At 3, I'd have the Padres, 4, the Cardinals, 5, the Braves, and then 6, the Phillies. Which that doesn't necessarily reflect on how good I think each team are, but that's just kind of how it goes when we have to do the seeding like this. So that would put the Cardinals and the Braves up against each other in the first round. That would be in the wild card. That would be insane. That's a matchup that it could go either way. And then I would have the Padres versus the Phillies, which if you want to see offense, that would be a historic series, at least when we're looking at it at this point. So
it was pretty good last year.
Yeah, yeah, it was. So, I mean, I guess just to kind of wrap up my thoughts on this, there's so much baseball to be played. I mean, historically, it's a very long season and so much can change. We can't predict injuries, we can't predict slumps. This is just looking at the rosters now and how we project these teams to be. But I mean, there's a lot to look forward to this season. We're not really going into the season with a championship favorite, at least a heavy one. This can go a lot of different ways. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, just like you said, I think in the end, the only thing that we can really expect is that if the Mets are in first place, they're not going to end in first place.
Of course not.
So um, that's just what history shows. And like we were talking about too, just to kind of trail back to that, the injury. We are talking about how the Mets, we're not really sure how the pitching is going to go before, especially with their two big pitchers now. And they'll still be a good team. They'll figure it out in the end. But
Yeah.
one quick point that I want to talk about, as we're recording this tonight, will be the final game in the WBC, and it'll be Japan against Team USA. And we've seen Mike Trout lead the USA and Shohei lead Team Japan. So I think it'd just be interesting, like two like great leaders. If they got them on the same team, what could they do?
You think if you get the best player from the USA and the best player from Japan and put them, in the AL, it would make the playoffs at least. Probably win multiple World Series, but you know that could never happen. So I guess
Two perennial MVPs. One guy who has pretty much been the MVP every year that he's been in the league.
Oh yeah, two Hall of Famers too. I mean, if those guys were on the same team, they would run baseball, especially if they had a good roster around them too.
And also, I'm glad to see my guy, Captain America, Trey Turner, biggest hit of his life. And that just made me even more excited to see him on the Phillies. And with Bryce Harper out to start the season, he's going to have a big load to fill. So hopefully, yeah, just leave it at
Yeah.
that. So next, we're going to move on to the NFL. We've had we'll talk about the draft a little bit and some free agency. And the first thing I want to talk about, since we recorded last week's episode, it kind of came out, I guess the trade ended up happening before the episode came out, but since we recorded before, we didn't get to talk about it. But as a Giants fan, quickly, I just want to go over the Darren Waller trade. I know there's been people on both sides of this. Darren Waller's injury prone, but he also has like 1,000-yard seasons when he's healthy. He's had injuries in his career. So did Odell. And when Odell played, he was good. So the Giants pretty much have been the most injury riddled team every single season. So it's going to happen either way. But I just want to ask this to start because I personally had in our past few mock drafts, them taking Darnell Washington kind of because I still think I don't think they're going to take a tight end necessarily in the first round, but if someone slips, maybe the third round, I'm not going to rule it out just because I think even with Darren Waller there too, I think they could still definitely take a guy too, the way that they run the offense. And especially in like the way the NFL is set up now, you can run a tight end at wide receiver too with all their wide receiver holes. So I just want to ask you now, do you think I guess in the first round, essentially, what do you think the Giants target here?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this moves them away from tight end in the first round. That seems pretty apparent right now. But with that in mind, it really opens up the Giants to take the best player available now. You know, they do have positional needs. And, you're a fan of the Giants. I'm sure you have your opinions on, what those needs are. But I will say from the outside looking in, there's none that are super apparent. I don't really think there's a single position that the Giants desperately need. So that makes it really fun that whoever slips to their spot, it's going to be a good pick. So I really think this is, regardless of position, you can take the best player available here. And, I just think overall, if I'm the Giants, you want more talent on the roster. The team is making a playoff push. Trading for Darren Waller makes that super obvious. And, you get Daniel Jones back. You have no reason not to just get as much talent on your roster as possible. So I really like the move. I think the trade I understand why the Raiders made the move as well. Darren Waller was not going to stick around long. But if I'm the Giants, you don't have to give up too much. Like, I think the Giants are going to have one of the most interesting drafts this year because of this move.
Yeah, I mean, essentially they traded Kadarius Toney for Darren Waller, so
Right.
I'll take that. And I think it's interesting now too because with him and a guy like Daniel Bellinger, who I think overall wasn't really talked about that much last year, just because a first-year tight end, he didn't have that many like huge plays. But watching all the games, I thought he was a great player overall. So I like that 1-2 punch and re-signing Matt Breida too. If they didn't re-sign him, honestly, I could have seen them going with a running back maybe in the first round, which would have been a little controversial. But I mean, a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs could have been a good pick there too.
Yeah.
I think now it's kind of weird because I'd made a mock draft after just to see what would be available, in my opinion. And there's going to be someone that falls. And when we're doing mock drafts, we don't take account for people who fall just because if we're in the eyes of picking for every single team. So if we see a good player on the board, some teams may have him as like a second round talent. So I
Right.
think at this point, we just kind of have to wait to see what the Giants do because I don't really see them locked into a specific position. I think they could even take. I know some people have been talking about Josh Downs. I don't know if I'm in love with the pick for a first round pick. I think he's worth it, but from the Giants aspect, if a guy like even Brian Brzee falls that far, which I think he could, pretty much any D tackle or edge guy, they do have a good defensive tackle unit right now, and the edge being bulked up. Aziz Ojolari, Jihad Ward, Kayvon Thibodeau. But like you said, I mean, you can't have too much talent, especially at a position like that when they run so many different sets defensively. I think overall, right now, in my eyes, it's a defensive player. But if there's a tackle that falls, I'd be willing to do that too. Maybe even move him to guard too, just because they kind of already spent the picks at this point. Evan Neal's locked in and Andrew Thomas is locked in, even though Evan Neal didn't have a great season last year. I mean, it's his first year, so I think he's going to figure it out.
Yeah, and I just want to segue this into our next point. You mentioned Josh Downs and how the Giants could look to draft a receiver. But what we're seeing with receivers so far in this NFL draft process is there is no clear wide receiver one. So I want to ask the question, or probably open this up more for discussion. Who is the wide receiver one, and what are some points you can make for different receivers?
I think overall, Quentin Johnson has been the number one wide receiver for a while. And when I was looking through all the tape and everything, it's just he doesn't stand out too much as he's still obviously a really good player, first round talent, but I think we've just been spoiled at wide receiver position just like the past 3, 5 years, even 10 years in the draft, that we're just used to the number one guy being a Jamar Chase kind of guy, or even a Jalen Waddle, who wasn't the number one receiver. But if you put him in this class, I think he's number one, like way above the rest of these guys. And that's not to downplay them, but a guy like Jackson Smith and Jigba, who a lot of people have as wide receiver two, and a lot of people even have him as wide receiver one. I wouldn't be surprised if he fell to the like early 20s pick. And I think it's interesting just to look at because Quentin Johnson, his case for number one is he's pretty much the only big receiver in this draft that has established himself. And for Jackson Smith and Jigba, his plea is basically, I mean, he had an amazing career at Ohio State, and he's more of a slot guy too, which could knock some teams down from him. But some teams also maybe want a slot receiver too. Like a team like the Ravens, they're kind of in the market for that guy right now. And even I'd like to slide in Jordan Addison. I'm a fan of him, but he even has some holes in his play too. So I think it's just going to be interesting overall. I think if a guy like Jordan Addison, a perfect scenario for him would end up on the Steelers and he would be back with his college quarterback. But we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, and I want to get my 2 cents in on this. I like Addison a lot, but I'm really going to focus on Johnston, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Quinn Johnson is 6'3", 210, long arms. He got over 1,000 yards this junior year he just had with TCU. And as you said, he's one of the only really tall guys in this draft class. And his speed is a little bit underrated. I do worry about him a little bit, as you mentioned. If you throw a guy like Jalen Waddle in this draft class, he would be number one. I think what I see with Quinn Johnson is I don't know how high the floor is. I'm starting to see kind of a boomer bust guy. A ceiling that you mentioned in past episodes was Andre Johnson. I really like that. But one that I've been seeing buzzing around is AJ Green. I think he profiles very similarly. Anyways, for the floor, I see a former TCU receiver, Josh Doxson. He was another guy that went kind of early and it's just fallen off into, nothingness. There's only so much you can project for a wide receiver based off physical tools. If you ask me personally, I like Johnson's game outside of his physical ability. So I might slide him number one. But when we talk about JSN, he's incredibly athletic. I'm convinced he can play slot and outside. Obviously, he'd be a smaller outside guy, but he's 5'11". He's not, incredibly short. And the injury history is what concerns me. And I think it's what's going to concern some NFL GMs, which could cause him to slide. But to me, he's like all those other Ohio State receivers that just came out, like Olave and Wilson. I think he'll have an impact day one. To me, he reminds me a lot of a faster or maybe prime Julian Edelman, the way he can play that slot or be a smaller outside guy. And the floor to me is like a current Robert Woods, how he struggles to get open a little bit because of the size. With that being said, I'm going to go like you. I'm not necessarily going to pick one right now, but either one of those guys are fighting for it for me.
Looking at both of these guys, I'm not in love with either one of them, which is kind of weird because I feel like every single draft, even if it's not the best receiver, I kind of just stick with a guy that I really like. And for a while it was Jordan Addison, but it just overall, looking at his game, he's a good receiver, but he has some holes that I don't know how well it'll translate to the NFL game just because it's not like quarterback at wide receiver because at quarterback, if you're big and you have a good arm, you can work on the accuracy. If you're a receiver and you struggle to get open in college and you go to the NFL, it's not going to get better. And
Yeah.
Jordan Addison he's a good receiver overall. And I wouldn't be like, if he ends up falling and the Giants can take him, I would love the pick. But as a number one guy, comparing him to Quentin Johnston, I think Johnston just has an overall, at least more athleticism. He's bigger and just a bigger guy overall. And JSN, a good player too, but the injury concerns and essentially you said that he could play a little bit on the outside just because we've seen smaller receivers too. But I think most teams would kind of just limit him to a slot role. And most of the time, I mean, some teams have their slot receiver as their number one guy. They just put him in the slot. So it wouldn't be a bad thing overall. I mean, we saw Odell do that for years. That's pretty much what his whole game was. But Odell played on the outside too and had success. And I could see him kind of being a little bit of a comparison to JSN and those stances. But I just don't really love a guy as my number one at this point. And I'm sure there's some teams that do. One interesting one, like I think the Patriots, if they had an option between the two, I think it'd be interesting because I could see them going either way. And I could honestly see them going with even Jordan Addison too at that point, because we don't really know. And especially from their standpoint, getting Juju, which we'll talk about a little later, do they want to maybe go with JSN at that point if he's available or Jordan Addison? So we'll just see what happens.
Yeah.
And I guess we can just go right into that right now. Just to talk about it quickly. The Patriots did get overall, we'll just talk about James Robinson, Juju, and Gesicki. So obviously 3 pieces to their offense that will be going in there. So I just want to hear your initial thoughts about these 3, or if you want to break it up, however you want to do it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just talk about them in general. We don't have to deep dive into this one. But as a Patriots fan, I love seeing us get some big name offensive guys. It seems like it's been forever since I could say that. I also think it would have been in New England's favor to just give the contract we gave to Juju to Jacoby Myers. It came out afterwards. Myers was pretty upset because it was the exact contract he was asking for. And, deciding who is better between them is pretty difficult because they're different receivers. But I just think for the sake of knowing the system and continuously improving, I would have loved to see Jacoby Myers stay. I'm interested to see the Patriots still pursue offense in the draft early because, the way we've been mocking it, they go offense pretty much every time in our mocks. But if you get a guy like James Robinson, you don't, they probably wouldn't have gone running back that early anyways, but you get the idea. You get a guy like Juju, maybe you don't go receiver. You're shirt up at tight end. Your offensive line is looking better. maybe they go defense now. And so, as a fan, that's exciting to me to see where we go, whether that be edge or corner. But I want to know if Bill is getting these guys to complement guys in the draft, or so we don't have to take guys in the draft. So that's just what I'm thinking about.
Well, I want to ask you one thing. I didn't even have this written down, but just what you said, they're shored up at tight end. I think that's a little interesting considering the Patriots have been a revolving door of tight ends the past few years. And I think you can agree with that too.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've seen kind of, I would say, a draft blunder with Ossie and who else did they take in that?
Dalton Keene.
Yeah. And then they just lost. All the tight ends are slipping my mind.
Johnny Smith.
Yeah, Jonnu Smith. Obviously,
Yeah.
he was a big signing for them last year too. And I just overall, even signing Gesicki, do you think a guy like Michael Mayer is still in the picture for them?
My only thing is if I'm New England and I see how horrible we've been at drafting tight ends since Rob Gronkowski, Aaron Hernandez, we get good production from tight ends pretty much every year, and that's just how the system goes. Hunter Henry was a really great tight end last year, which I think got overshadowed a little bit. And Johnny Smith just didn't play the role. I think moving on from him was more of a contract thing. So Gesicki profiles more to me as a receiving type tight end. He can block, but we have two big tight ends that can catch the ball. A shirt up is a stretch. I could see why they would look at a guy like Kincaid or Mayer or any other tight end. But if you attack that early, you're banking on your third tight end. And the Patriots are the worst team in the AFC East. If we're taking the third tight end instead of a starting corner or edge, I think that just says more about the team than how good the prospect is.
Are you saying that they're the worst, assuming Aaron Rodgers is going to the Jets, or even without Aaron Rodgers?
Definitely assuming he's going to the Jets. If he doesn't end up going to the Jets, you could still argue it. They're third.
I think it's still pretty close.
Yeah.
And I think just overall, it's kind of become, for the Patriots at least, they're not a terrible team. Like they still have good pieces. I think they're still even like a 7-9 win team, which I know by Patriots standards, the past 20 years just seems like a throwaway season, but like you have to end up committing to the rebuild at some point. And I know it's tough with a young quarterback. You kind of want to develop him too, and they want to be able to still be in this position. But they're in the same exact position, especially with Aaron Rodgers going to the Jets whenever that happens, that the Raiders were in last year in that division. Obviously, we expected the Broncos to be better, but going into that season, the Raiders they're still a good team overall, but the prospect of the Broncos with Russell Wilson, which didn't pan out, but overall before the season, the Chiefs with Mahomes and the Chargers with Justin Herbert, that like automatically made the Raiders the worst team in the division. That doesn't mean that they're a bad team, but the Patriots are kind of falling into that trap. So do you think they need to commit to the rebuild, or do you think they should take a year or two off? What do you think they need is the next step?
Well, I mean, coming from us, we're, to profile us, I guess, we're young, sports fans who really like the NFL draft. So if coming from me, I'm going to say yes, commit to the rebuild. There's going to be guys, but if we can be honest, the Patriots kind of thrive on, being solid, I guess. They're known for having, crazy fans, whatever. If the Patriots commit to a rebuild, it's going to have harsh repercussions on Bill Belichick and Robert Kraft. So I can see why they're not doing it, if I'm being honest with you. I think what is more likely to happen, even though I'm saying right now I would like them to rebuild, Bill Belichick's contract is up in 2 years. I think the Patriots are going to stay in this limbo spot where they pretend like they're trying to compete and just get the 15th through 18th pick every year for those 2 years. Once Belichick's gone, I think it's a perfect opportunity to really look at your roster. Mac Jones is going to be a free agent that year. He's going to be 26-ish. You can decide to finally move on, which I wish we would do right now. Or, if he plays up to the standards, you re-sign him and he's your quarterback for the rebuild. I feel like there's a lot of directions New England could go. Not a lot of them are good right now. So coming from me, I would like to, start the process early and just suck now. But, the more we wait, the older Matt gets, and the more likely he is to fall off if he hasn't already. And, our roster is made up of really bad players and some really good older players. If this rebuild takes us 4 years, we're not going to have Matthew Judon. We already saw McCourty go this year. Guys are aging out of this. So I think it's in our favor to rip it down and start all over again, like you said. I think that's the move.
Yeah, even Donta Hightower too, that came out today.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're in an interesting spot, and we'll move away from that a little bit too. But also interesting too, James Robinson. I love James Robinson, and I think it's a good signing. But to pay him top 16 running back money, essentially, with Ramondre Stevenson, who I think was before this season, like even the year before, good player. And I think he was even underutilized this season just because the Patriots have been in love with their 2 or 3 running back rotation, and they just won't commit to one guy, which I'm not a Patriots fan, but it kind of makes me upset that they have a good running back who could be a number 1 guy who they could feed the ball to, and they just kind of essentially ignore him. And that happened up until, I mean, what was it, like week 6 or 7 where Ramondre kind of started seeing all the carries?
Yeah, when Damian Harris got hurt, he finally got to get the bulk load of them.
So next we'll move on. One thing that we can go over quickly, do you think the Raiders are in the market of trading up for a quarterback? I've seen some people talk about potentially trading up to maybe that 4th pick and getting a guy, or even the 5th pick, depending on where you look, to kind of set that. Some people are in love with the idea of the 4 quarterbacks going the first 4 picks. So do you think they're still in the market to trade up?
I think I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to argue no. So I just want to throw out the argument of why I don't think they will. And that's because I don't think they're going to get in the spot to get Stroud or Young pretty clearly. The Panthers and the Texans kind of hold the reins there. So if you don't get one of those top 2 guys, I don't think it's worth moving up, because especially that would put you, if you do trade up all the way to 3 to get, Richardson or Levis. And I don't know if I would throw that many assets away to get one of those guys. I'm a huge Richardson guy, but to jump the Colts, who I think at that spot would take Richardson, it's going to take a lot. And Arizona at 3 knows that. The asking price for a team to move up in front of Indianapolis, Arizona could get kind of whatever they want. So I don't know if it's worth it for the Raiders to throw that much at it. When you have Jimmy Garoppolo, currently this year, the Raiders are going to attempt to compete. If you hold Will Levis on your bench for a year, then, no disrespect, but that's a 25-year-old quarterback making his debut. At that point, I would just wait till maybe next year. You can attack a dude like May, Williams, or whoever else is a top-tier quarterback prospect at that time. So I'm going to say no, I don't think they will. With that being said, as you mentioned, they could. So I actually want to hear your opinions on this real quick.
I think overall, if I'm the Raiders, you sign Jimmy Garoppolo, and it's going to be an interesting situation. That's kind of why I wanted to ask about this. And I think you just got to sit there, and unless you're really in love with a guy, which at this point, I don't really see that. I know we both have Anthony Richardson going forward to the Colts, but like the Colts could love Will Levis and go with that. So
Yeah.
we don't really have the report out now. Usually we get the report kind of like a week or 2 before of where everything is going. I remember even 2 days before the draft, I think it was 2 years ago at this point, where the Giants were in the market to get a tackle, and we're kind of going back and forth on who we think they would get. And then I just saw a report where they said they were going to take Andrew Thomas, which I was kind of surprised about. But we don't really know what teams love until kind of the week or 2 before the draft. So if I'm the Raiders, I think Levis falls to them, and I think Levis is their guy at this point. I think if they take Anthony Richardson, it's not a bad thing. I think that's good for them. He can develop with Jimmy Garoppolo. That's a good spot. But both of these guys are quarterbacks that need to develop. And I think in their eyes, I don't think they see much of a difference between them. In my eyes, I do. And I know for you too, but I think they just stay at that spot. I don't really see them trading up too.
Yeah. And you mentioned a dude like Levis. who has the potential to fall. And that segues us perfectly to Jalen Carter. His whole situation off the field, and I think he's a guy that could have fell anyways, especially with how the board has moved.
Yeah.
So with that being said, we see a lot of buzz in mock drafts that have Jalen Carter falling all the way down to 9. Do you think that's going to happen?
I think if you're the Seahawks and you pass on Jalen Carter, this is probably the biggest mistake since the Super Bowl with not running the ball. I think especially now, the way the team is set up, Jalen Carter is arguably the best player in the draft. And I don't think he's better than Will Anderson, but I think he's kind of a little step down, but that does make him the second best guy in the draft. And I think overall, if you just miss on this pick, I think you just mess up overall because you're in a spot where you don't really know if you're going to be drafting this high again, just because you're kind of committing to Geno Smith, and they're essentially going to be in the same scenario as like the Patriots are at this point, where they're fake competing, maybe get the 7th seed in the playoffs. And Jalen Carter is a piece that will fit into your team really well and just be a great player for them for 10 plus years.
Yeah, and I like that sentiment, but I'm going to argue it the other way. I don't think he should fall past 9 to answer the original question. Definitely could happen. The character issues are becoming a big deal. To me, I have a good friend here who's a pretty big Seahawks fan, and I was talking to him about this today. He reminded me, not only were the Seahawks actually pretty good at D tackle last year, they just signed 2 more in free agency. So I think that opens up a chance where the Seahawks can go, hey, let's get a guy opposite Tariq Woolen. Let's get Christian Gonzalez, or hey, let's trade down. So if that happens, Jalen Carter could start to slip. And that's where I see, all right, maybe it could happen. I think it gets to a point where the character issues hurt, but the positional value hurts even more. We saw a team like Chicago, who really does need a defensive tackle, move out of that top spot. So that opens up so many more things to happen. So I don't think he should. I think, as you said, he's probably my second best player in the draft. So he should definitely go top 5 for me. But if he falls past 9, I wouldn't be too surprised, honestly.
Well, just kind of to go back on your point, if they end up taking a guy like Christian Gonzalez, I think the Lions take him at 6. I don't think he
Right.
falls past 6 because the Lions can take him there. And even if they do end up taking a guy like Tyree Wilson at 5, I think the Lions still take him at 6 and then address cornerback with their what is it, 20 something pick at this point.
Yeah.
I forget, wherever they pick again.
Yeah, I just want to argue the other way, though. I mean, let's say in this hypothetical, which this is not how my mock would go. I'm sure it's not how yours would. If the Seahawks get Gonzalez and I'm the Lions and Tyree Wilson still on my board, a lot of people would have Tyree going to Seattle. You get him on the opposite side of Hutch, and that's lethal. And then we get to 7, and the Raiders are hanging around, and Will Levis is on the board. They're probably going to go him. Then we go to 8. Off the top of my head, I can't remember who's at 8. Chicago.
The Falcons. I think the Falcons take Jalen Carter.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think the Falcons have so many different needs, and this would put them in a point where they could take any playmaker they want. I know you take Drake London last year, but you still need a lot more, especially if you're rolling with Desmond Ridder. I guess my point is, I'm only arguing this so far because I have Jalen Carter definitely going at least in my top 6. But if the draft starts falling in these ways and teams are like, okay, I'm not going to take a chance on this dude that doesn't have high positional value and is getting in trouble off the field and not doing very well in interviews with, scouts, I could see him going. So, I'm going to say no, he doesn't. But if the question is, could he? Absolutely.
So the Bears could come out with the heist of the century and just
They
get their
could
guy
still
at
get
9
him.
that they could have got at 1.
That would be that would show as one of the best NFL draft trades ever. That actually happens.
Yeah. So next we'll kind of segue into the Cowboys. With Zeke officially kind of being gone. This will probably be quick, but I just want to ask you, do you think they go with Bijan here in the draft?
Yeah, I'm going to be really quick. I think I don't think they'll go with him, but I think they'll explore it at least. I don't think they should take him. I'm a big Tony Pollard guy. You can pursue a lot of other things in free agency this year. whether it's now or even during the season. Bijan is going to be amazing. If they take him, it wouldn't be a bad pick. I just think the Cowboys, especially as a team looking to compete before Dak Prescott's on the way out, I think you've got to get something else at this spot. What do you think?
I've had them mock to take Bijan for a while, and then I kind of went away with it, keeping Pollard. But with Zeke gone, I think he fills the role that Zeke had at that point of being the power back, and then you have Tony Pollard. I think that would be a good matchup together too. Another kind of wrench you could throw into it too is the Eagles just had Bijan out for a like private meeting, pre-draft meeting the other day. So that could be something to watch out for. And I guess kind of in your scenario too, if Dallas doesn't take him at 26 and the Bills are like, we don't really want Bijan, we have bigger holes, I think he could fall to 30 at the Eagles. Or if the Eagles really like him, they have the capital to trade up too. So I think it'll be interesting.
I was going to say, we don't really know how NFL draft stuff goes all the time. There could be teams fighting to trade up for Bijan. That could be the Eagles pick at 10 for all we know. He's
Yeah.
good enough where it wouldn't be a bad pick. It's just we're going to have to see how the draft board goes. So with that being said, Cowboys could do a lot of things there. I don't think they necessarily should take Bijan, even though he's going to be a stud.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this pretty much every week when we talk about the draft. Bijan is a top 10 guy, but position wise, just like Brian Branch, they're going to fall. And
Right.
unless someone trades up for them, which both of those guys could definitely be a scenario that they could be traded up for. And
Yeah.
then next, to talk about the Cowboys a little more, they did trade for Brandon Cooks. Interesting for the Cowboys in this scenario, just because they have a guy like CeeDee Lamb, who I think has quickly gone from people saying he's overrated to becoming underrated. I think he's a really good young receiver. And losing Dalton Schultz, obviously kind of a big hit. I think that was kind of understated by a lot of people. Dalton Schultz was a very good tight end for them. And I think overall trading, I think it was a fifth this year and a sixth next year. That's kind of a steal for Brandon Cooks. I know he's been moving on and off teams for a while, but I still think he's maybe not an elite talent, but especially to be paired with a guy like CeeDee Lamb. Those are two guys that are going to work really well together.
Yeah. I mean, you get Cooks here and you pay, a very low price to get your wide receiver 2 or 3, depending on the offense, depending on Michael Gallup. It's a great trade for Dallas. Houston had absolutely no leverage, so you couldn't really ask for a lot. Brandon Cooks was not going to play for Houston this year. He was going to find a way out no matter what. I think it fills up one of the needs that the Cowboys had. We were mocking them Bijan, but we were also mocking them receiver a lot. Now you don't have to worry about receiver. So I think what the Cowboys are doing right now, the intent for them obviously is to be good, but in my head, the intent is they're filling up holes as many as they can before the draft. So they really get to attack specifically what they want. I think it was a good trade.
Yeah, and signing him too. And even if Bijan's gone at this point, whoever falls between Kincaid and Michael Mayer, I think is
Yeah.
definitely on the board. And I didn't really consider that before, but just thinking about it now, looking at the depth chart and everything, I think both of those guys fit in well, especially Michael Mayer. Going to be Jason Witten again for him, and then just keep the role filling.
That is exactly what I was going to say. I don't necessarily see Mayer as being as good as Jason Witten, but
Yeah, the
when
comparison's there.
they play so similarly, I think, this is, how we get into the draft season and we see locks really far down the board where it just makes sense. It's going to happen no matter what. Mayer to the Cowboys at that pick, if that's where his value lines up, that might be one of our pre-draft early locks. I really like that fit now that you mention it.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting depending on where the Bucks go because they have so many needs, and we've seen
Right.
them kind of linked with Mayer or Kincaid. So,
Yeah.
next, Adam Thielen signed with the Panthers and kind of giving their or I guess their QB1 a new wide receiver one. Their receiver core is kind of shaky to say the best. They do have some guys that I know we're both a fan of. Laviska Shenault, good receiver, but kind of still unproven. Terrace Marshall, I'm a big fan of him, but unproven too. So now they get a guy like Adam Thielen and both of those guys in there too, and their QB1. I think that's a good wide receiver room too. I think Adam Thielen fits on this team really well, especially with Laviska being a very good slot guy, and then Terrace, a big receiver too for the outside. And what it looks like CJ Stroud going into the scenario, both of those guys, Marshall and Laviska Shenault, play a lot like the guys that CJ Stroud was throwing to for the past few years, and getting Adam Thielen, who was very underutilized by the Vikings last year just because they spam the ball to Justin Jefferson for good reason, obviously. But Adam Thielen just kind of put in the background. And overall, CJ Stroud's going to have a safety blanket too, and he'll have two guys that he can also improve with.
Yeah, I think the Panthers are cooking up something underrated this offseason. You go get Thielen, you get Miles Sanders. They're still really tied closely with DJ Shark. Like, they're trying to build a roster so CJ Stroud or Bryce Young or whoever it is doesn't fall flat on their face out the gate. They're not building a championship roster or even really a playoff roster, but they're building a roster to develop their quarterback, which I think is really all you need. If you sent CJ Stroud, for example, out there with Laviska Shenault as your number one receiver and no running back, like, sure, it would be perfect for tanking, but CJ Stroud would lose all confidence. So I think
Yeah.
they're making a really smart play of building a roster to make their quarterback better, and then you reevaluate once you see if your QB is that guy. So I like their moves all free agency so far.
Well, I mean, they signed their running back in Miles Sanders too.
Yeah,
So now they have him and Chuba Hubbard, who had a good year last year, and he's going to keep developing. But overall, this is going to be a really young and exciting offense. Obviously, besides Thielen, but you kind of need that, especially for a young quarterback. You need the safety blanket. But
yeah,
I mean, I like all these guys, so they're going to be a fun team to watch. And maybe not that good, but you give them a few years, and we could definitely see them kind of being in that Jaguars role where they might not be great this year, but they're building the foundation. And with next year's offseason, with the draft and free agency, they could start to make a push. Maybe not make the playoffs within the next 2 years, but make that push and develop everything.
yeah. They're putting themselves on the right track. I totally agree.
And then next, Baker Mayfield going to Tampa Bay. Kind of an interesting move. Not very much talked about this just because Baker Mayfield has really kind of fallen off a cliff as of recently. So, I mean, the reports coming out, they didn't sign him necessarily to be the number one quarterback. Like, he's gonna probably have a quarterback battle, which is kind of interesting. If you said that a few years ago that he would be battling with Kyle Trask for QB1, I would have been shocked, but
Yeah.
we'll see what happens with them just because at 19, they're not really in the market for a quarterback. And I think they can definitely benefit from kind of tanking this year to get a guy next year. So I don't really have too many opinions on this.
Yeah, and my opinions on this are pretty harsh, if I can be honest with you. It just makes things even more complicated at quarterback, and it confirms they'll have the worst quarterback room in the NFL this year. It's really bad because you're not good enough to already have the quarterback on the roster. Clearly, Tom Brady's gone now, and you're not bad enough to get the quarterback, and they didn't have enough money to get it through free agency. Like, if they weren't paying, they're not a team meant to rebuild because they're paying all these dudes big money. If they had money to throw, I'm sure they'd be chasing Lamar Jackson, but you can't pay him. So I mean, I don't love the signing. I get it. He is better than Trask. So in that sense, I do like the signing. He's a dude that will play better than Kyle Trask, in my opinion. But putting yourself in a QB battle between those two, as you mentioned, I don't know what else they could have done, but this seems just like giving up to a point.
Yeah. And then next, the Texans getting Devin Singletary and Dalton Schultz. Some good players, but they're also in a scenario where they don't really have a quarterback, but they're kind of sticking with their guy in Davis Mills, which, in my opinion, a little interesting, especially. Well, I guess they'll have a quarterback soon, but
Yeah.
I completely blanked out on that one. They will have their guy soon, and they're going to have some targets to throw to. So, especially with a guy like Bryce Young too, I think this will be good for him. The rest of the team completely terrible,
Yeah.
and Dalton Schultz and Devin Singletary aren't going to save the team. So we'll see how Bryce Young does on that team. And losing Brandon Cooks too, I feel bad for him because he's going to end up in a scenario that was worse than Trevor Lawrence in his first year, and that was pretty bad.
Yeah. I mean, when a team's that bad, you kind of just need to do anything to get something. Like if they sign Singletary or Dalton Schultz and they have a really good year, that you can start keeping them around. You know, they can show out. And those guys have proven that at times they can be great. I mean, Schultz was really good just last year. So, you know, you sign these guys, one, because they're willing to come to your team, and two, just in case they, you know, show out. If Singletary goes crazy next year and is not a top 10 running back and wants to stick around, great. If not, you just stick with Dameon Pierce. You know, you got to take chances at dudes at some point. So, although I think these signings are good, it's not something I'm looking too deep into.
And then one more final point in the NFL. This will probably be quick, but the Patriots have been a kind of dark horse team to get Lamar Jackson. Do you have any faith in this at all, or is this just kind of word of mouth? No?
Not at all. I would love
Okay.
it. We talk about this. Lamar's like a top 5 quarterback in the NFL for me, but
Mhm.
the Patriots would never. If they do, I'll come on here and scream and be excited, but probably not.
Yeah. So next, we'll kind of end with the NBA. And just to start, I want to talk about how we feel with the contenders in the NBA. Recently, we've seen teams struggle. We've seen teams do well. We've seen Julius Randle drop 55 points, however many he dropped against the Timberwolves, and still lose. And I know you're a big supporter of the Knicks this year. You have them going to the finals.
Yeah,
So
for
we'll get
sure.
into that too. First, I want to talk about the Celtics. Recently, they've gotten it together a little bit, but Jason Tatum definitely hasn't. Jason Tatum has been on a streak of shooting that looks like he just announced his tour dates with Drake. It has been bad. And I just want to know how you think the Celtics fare with this overall. I know off of the podcast, we've seen people talk about being first round exits. And I know that's not true, but one thing I want to bring up, I think the NBA fan bases overall is the one sport where if a team loses one game, the whole season is over. Like last night, as they were recording, the Sixers just lost to the Bulls at home in double overtime, losing their 8-game win streak. And people are ready to just like let go of James Harden because he had a bad game and just like blow up the whole team because Embiid fouled out. Still had what, like 36, 38, and like I think 14, but he fouled out in the first overtime. I think the NBA overall just has like the fans just want to blow up everything after one loss. But the Celtics, I want to bring this up first. They've been on a skid as of the past. What it seems like every week we get on and we keep talking about it.
Yeah. So I mean, as you mentioned, Jason Tatum's numbers kind of looked like our friend Cam Mays at P-Town Courts. Like the shots were going up, they weren't hitting the net. But one thing I want to mention is we saw this early in the season last season, and as we know, the Celtics made the finals. I think this is kind of what comes with having a star that is a streaky shooter. I mean, even in, of course, you're going to love this comparison. Even in the early days of the Lakers with Kobe, you know, they were one of the best teams in the league, but they would go on losing streaks. They would go on big winning streaks. I think one of the biggest ever, actually. But they would go on losing streaks because although Kobe is a great player, a better player than Tatum will ever be, he is hilarious. He is streaky at times. One thing that's impressed me about this run, and it hasn't been horrible, you know, it's not like they're on an 8-game losing streak. It's just been mid for a team that's
Yeah.
supposed to be the best in the league. One thing that's impressed me is that despite being so shaky, Jaylen Brown has played so well. His comments about the Celtics and the media, those have also been shaky. But when it comes to his play, he's been really solid. And so when Jason Tatum comes back to form, which you say what you will about his performance in the finals last year because it was horrible. But when it comes to the playoffs in general, he's always on his A game. So Tatum and Brown, once you know they're back on the same page, I still think the Celtics are probably one of the best teams in the league, if not the best.
Yeah. As of right now, when we're recording this, they're the 2 seed. They're battling with the Sixers right now just because the Sixers went on that win streak. So we'll end up seeing what happens. But like if we're just looking at it right now in the standings, they would be playing against the Heat in the first round, which I think they beat the Heat. But even if they fall to the 3 seed, they play the Nets in the first round. Like either way, it's an easy win for them just
Yeah.
because the East has kind of been outside of the top 5, like whoever makes it in the play-in tournament, the Nets are only good and only in this spot because they had KD and Kyrie at the start of the season. If they weren't here, I think they're maybe like at this point they're 39 and 32. If they had this roster the whole season, I love Mikal Bridges, but maybe like a 25 win team.
Yeah, they would be at best borderline play-in tournament.
So, I mean, we'll give it like a week or two, but as of right now, you're not hitting the panic button on the Celtics.
No, I'm not. And like I was saying, I won't get all into it again, but Tatum has had these streaks before and people have freaked out. And then slowly but surely, he's picked it back up. It's a little frustrating that it's at this point in the season when people are trying to make playoff pushes, but this isn't something new to Celtics fans, even though they act like it. But I'm not totally panicked. I still think they're finals contenders.
So then we'll bounce over to the West right now, the number one team in the West, the Nuggets. And I think they're going to keep up with this. They're 4 games above the Grizzlies. Grizzlies have their struggles. They're 5 games above the Kings. Nuggets are going to end with the first seed. So if you look at 6 through 10 right now, they have the Warriors, the Mavs, and the Timberwolves, the Thunder, and the Jazz. And the Lakers are at 11. Who knows if they're going to sneak in or not? They could make it past the Thunder. But if you're the Nuggets at this point and you're looking at the teams, the Warriors, the Mavs, the Timberwolves, the Jazz, who do you want to play first round?
Yeah, so I had points for 3 teams here that I think they match up great against, which were the Timberwolves, the Thunder, and the Lakers. I'm just going to single in on the Timberwolves just for the sake that I think it's likely. And also, I really like the matchup. Gobert has shown in his, electric NBA career that nobody bullies him more than Embiid and Jokic. Lucky for the Nuggets, they have Jokic. It literally wouldn't even be close. That would be a 4-0 sweep, in my opinion. It would just flood the Timberwolves. And I'm going to be honest, Jamal Murray absolutely lights up whoever was planning on guarding him on the perimeter. And that doesn't even include Michael Porter Jr., who at times is the best scorer on that whole team. So just to keep it simple, if I'm the Nuggets, I want to see the Timberwolves in that first round. The matchups are perfect for a 4-0 sweep. But that makes me wonder, who do you have in that spot?
I mean, looking at those two, I know the Timberwolves are interesting just because they have the greatest center duo of all time. And that's how they built the team. I think they win that easily. I think the Mavericks are interesting. We'll talk about them later. But also like a team like the Jazz, if they end up playing the Jazz, I think they win that. And the Thunder too, I think pretty convincingly. But I wanted to bring this up just because I saw Nick Wright talk about it the other day. He said if they end up playing the Lakers in the first round, that AD and LeBron will bully them. And I know you probably have strong beliefs on that, being a Lakers hater and a Nuggets fanboy. So I think I just wanted to bring that up overall as the discussion. I don't think it's a sweep, but I think that Lakers could win a game in that. You might disagree with that, but
I think the Lakers could win a game. I don't hate that, but that at best has them losing in 5. If
yeah, well, he said that they bully them.
Yeah, I would love to see AD bully anyone with his ankles intact, to be honest.
Well, LeBron's in Germany getting his serum right now, so once he comes back, you're going to regret that.
All right.
And then next, the Bucks. They've won a lot of games recently, but how do you feel about them? Obviously, they're the first seed right now, but with Giannis's availability being kind of up in the air right now, playing some games, being out some games, and we don't really it's maybe because of injury. It's not all back-to-backs too. It's just he's played
Yeah.
a game Wednesday, missed Friday, and then didn't play again until like Tuesday. So do you think this affects them now, or do you think it's just kind of precautions before the playoffs?
I mean, I think it affects them right now, but I'm going to keep my positivity in the East going. I still think the Bucks compete. This doesn't worry me too much. One thing I'll say about them is I was just saying how the Celtics seem to click around playoff time. If there's any team that does that better, it's Milwaukee. They've been on a really good stretch here, but once Giannis comes back, which he will, Giannis will not be missing playoff games unless it's a serious injury. And Middleton comes back, and Holiday. Say what you want about Holiday. If there's one thing I can say about him, he's very consistent. You know what you're going to get from Drew Holiday. Once they're all back on the court, they're just uber talented. We have see guys like Bobby Portis and Brook Lopez be defensive threats too. Like it's just such a good team. So as you mentioned, I do think it's precautionary. I think the Bucks are trying. Maybe Giannis having like soreness or something. Then the Bucks just aren't trying to screw it up right before the playoffs, and I have respect for them for that. Middleton has been off his game when he's been back this year. He hasn't been playing in every game, obviously, but when he's been playing, he hasn't been great. I'm confident he'll figure it out. And if I can be completely honest with you, the Bucks have one playoff series while Middleton's been horrible before. So if he can figure it out in any capacity, I'm not worried about it. How do you feel about that, though?
I think with Chris Middleton kind of being like not great this year, and when we come to the playoffs, he plays good or he plays really good. There's not really that much of an in between. He has a really good game or he doesn't. And with Giannis kind of being up in the air, a first round series right now, they're looking at the Hawks. It's an easy win. But in the second round, if the seeding stays the same and they play the Cavs, I think that's a sneaky series, especially with Mobley and Donovan Mitchell too. I think like the Cavs could take that to 6 or 7 games, and depending on the availability and how Chris Middleton plays, we've seen, like you said, we've seen the Bucks play without Chris Middleton, but I think when that happened, the team was better, and obviously they won the championship that year. But I think the Cavs could be a sneaky team to see in the playoffs for the Bucks.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying there. I think to flip it from the Cavs to the Mavs, they've been having a lot going on. We haven't seen Luka and Kyrie on the court together at the same time, and we haven't seen this monumental jump from the Mavericks like we expected when they traded for Kyrie. Should they be worried?
I mean, they're 6-7 right now with Kyrie. Having a losing record since trading for him is not good at all, especially in the West and the spot that they're in the West, where if they win 2 games, they're essentially the 4th seed. Like they're the 7th seed right now. If they lose 2 games, they're the 11th seed. If they win 2 games, they're the 4th seed. And they're playing against teams like since they've had Kyrie, they're playing against the Clippers, where the Clippers are a good team, but they should win that game. It's going to be a playoff matchup potentially. They're playing against the Lakers, where they won the game off a game-winning 3, and it shouldn't have been that close. And I know Luka didn't play that game, and I know they've had a mix of Luka and Kyrie playing, but that's also an issue if they're not on the same, if they're not on the floor at the same time. And one point that I want to bring up is last year, kind of comparing it to the Sixers trade when they traded for Harden. Everyone expects the team to be really good when it starts, and even if they don't, obviously, I don't think they're going to win the championship this year. Even if they lose in the second round, I don't think the trade is just like terrible overall, as we've seen with the Sixers this year with the full offseason of James Harden and Embiid. Sometimes if you trade for a superstar, you just need that. And I think the expectations of when a team trades for a superstar in season, especially at the All-Star break, to just win the championship all of a sudden is kind of unrealistic.
Yeah. And, I think I'm not a guy that likes to grab the panic button and push it very often, but I will push it for this season. And as you mentioned, I won't push it for this trade.
I agree with that.
Yeah, this year they've been poor since trading for Kyrie. They're in a competitive West. I don't see them competing for the finals, but you need time. And, Kyrie, hopefully you assume will be back. And then you get to actually build a roster around those two. If the Mavericks planned on, winning the championship this season, I don't think they would have traded for Kyrie in the first place.
So next, we'll talk about the Grizzlies. Ja Morant should be coming back. I think the next game, as of our recording, he was in the stadium recently, and they're 6-4 in the last 10 without Ja, and they're 30-5 at home. Great home team. Terrible away, 14-22. So they're still the 2 seed though, and getting Ja back. And I know I said earlier that the Nuggets are going to keep the 1 seed. I agree with that, but they have been struggling a little bit recently. They're 5-5 in the last 10. They're going to figure it out, just like the Celtics will. They're good teams always figure it out. They have bad stretches at some point, and I think the Nuggets are a lot better than the Grizzlies. But do you think the Grizzlies getting Ja back at this point Do you think they're going to go on a run and kind of still compete, or do you think him being out and then coming back in is just going to mess up with the momentum?
There's a parade inside my city, yeah. Or whatever Ja's saying. Point is,
Yeah.
yeah, hilarious. Whatever Ja, to try to include that anyway, so it doesn't sound totally stupid. Ja's coming back and he has that energy. We see it already while he's back in the stadium. So I think the Grizzlies getting that boost of energy is almost as important as getting the player Ja back. And I know that sounds crazy, but if you're the Grizzlies, this is one of the least convincing second seeds I've seen in a long time. You need a boost of some sort. When we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, we were sitting here saying we didn't think Ja would be back all year just because stuff was looking so gloomy. If you can get the energy mixed with the player of Ja back, they could actually be dangerous. And I will come on here and say that. I don't necessarily think they are, but obviously when they were running the Desmond Bay and Jaren Jackson Jr. as the best players thing, they had no shot. If Ja comes back motivated and ready to play basketball instead of grittying to young boy and flashing guns on the camera, then that is a really solid team. And one thing I want to point out is that the Grizzlies were way better than my expectations without Ja Morant. The fact that they kept themselves in the second seed when I and probably many others expected them to at least fall to that 3 or 4 range was impressive to me. So I'm pretty confident. It hasn't been long enough where I feel like they won't be able to mold with Ja. It might be a tough first game back or something of that sort. But I mean, I think the Grizzlies, and this shouldn't be a hot take, are in a much better place with Ja back on the team. But I don't know. That could be a tough one.
Yeah, I think, like you said, they're the least convincing 2 seed since the Grizzlies last year.
Yeah,
And I think
you'd say that.
we like I forgot until I just looked at the standings that they were the 2 seed last year. And they're like ending up to be just a regular season team, which in sports, especially the NBA, we see this for a while. The Nuggets were on a stretch the past few years where they're really good in the regular season. The Jazz too, really good in the regular season. But if you can't get it done in the playoffs, the 2 seed doesn't matter. No one cares about the 2 seed when you can't win. Especially last year, they played the Warriors and did not fare well for them. And
No,
even this season, we've seen them. Um, I mean, Dylan Brooks has more technical fouls than he does 20-point games. Dylan Brooks is not good. And I'm on Draymond Green's side even before all this happened. I think Dylan Brooks is like just I think he tries to be like Pat Beverly. He tries to give off that energy, but he's just not good. I have not liked Dylan Brooks ever. And I think it's interesting that he said that he thought it was disrespectful that they compared him to Draymond Green. And then he compared himself to Draymond Green too a few years
yeah,
ago. I think he's a clown. I'll just say
yeah,
that.
yeah. I'm not a huge fan of his. He sold one of my locks of the day. Couldn't even make 2 threes. All he does is stand there and shoot threes. But I mean, just to bring that up, Dylan Brooks, I like the idea, and this will match up with what I was saying earlier. I like the idea of him trying to be the energy guy. Sometimes it's not that deep. Sometimes the best player on your team is the energy guy. We see it with Philly, Embiid. We see it with Boston, Tatum. Sometimes you need the energy from your best player just because they're the best player. Ja is the dude that gives you energy. Obviously, he's been, in some deep stuff, and now he's coming back from it. Dylan Brooks can't pretend to be Pat Bev. He's not the energy guy. There's few of those in the league left, and he is trying too hard. So I will side with you and Draymond in that sense.
I would even argue that they have 2 guys. I mean, you have Jaren Jackson be the energy guy on defense. What does
Oh,
Dylan Brooks do? He's the
oh,
energy guy
yeah.
running up and down the court, yelling at Klay Thompson on the sideline.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. You could say Steven Adams. At that point, I would put Bane over Brooks. I mean, Brooks is
Yeah,
trying to be relevant. Brooks basketball, he has the 5th worst true shooting in the NBA. Don't ask who I know that off the top of my head. Point is, he can't shoot anything right now. He can't shoot a ball into the ocean. So he's trying to be valuable in another sense. Usually, normal players would decide that would be defense. He decides it's talking to champions. So, I mean, whatever makes him feel useful. I don't want to hate on him too much. I really don't think he's that bad. Like he deserves to start on this team. But when dudes go through slumps, they do crazy things sometimes, and I think we're seeing that right now.
yeah, um, yeah. That's pretty
Yeah.
much all I got to say about Dylan Brooks too. So we'll wrap up this episode with a debate that has been going on for a while. I'm happy to see it now. Joel Embiid, the odds-on favorite at -220 to win the MVP. In my eyes, it's his award to lose. In yours, I just want to hear what you say about this just to start. We'll get the starting point out.
Well, so I will say before we get into the debate part of this, Embiid deserves to be the favorite right now. I will say that. And when you say it's Embiid's award to lose, I totally, I do agree with that. He has played amazing in this stretch. And, I'll dig into this a little bit into it, but, I think Jokic has also played really good, but it's been overshadowed by the fact the Nuggets are 5-5 in the last 10. When your team isn't performing at the level everyone knows they could, and Philly is, I see how this stuff happens, especially when Embiid is playing out of his mind. So I'll get that positive stuff out of the way first and just say, I agree with your original claims for sure. So we can get into it.
I mean, if we're gonna bring out the one stat that all of the Jokic fans have been talking about every single year, we're gonna talk about PER. And Joel Embiid is the most efficient player in the league right now. And I know that hurt a lot of Jokic fans when that came out that Embiid passed him. And I don't think that's the end all be all, but I think it is when Jokic is number one. I don't think it matters when Embiid is number one from what I've seen. But I mean, either way, they're going to be 1 and 2 when the season ends. And like, I don't see how Embiid doesn't win at this point. He's dropping, like, he had an off game the other night where he dropped 33, 7 and 7 because Harden wasn't playing. And he's like, okay, I'll be a playmaker then. So he passed the ball and he didn't even play the fourth quarter and he dropped those stats.
Well, okay. So here's what I'll argue with that before I bring in my other points, because I have some bullets that I feel like I really should get to. Point is, if Jokic is playing a game without Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr., you could argue the same thing. I think MVP opportunity does matter. That was a good opportunity to prove himself, and he did. Embiid's, one of the best players in the NBA by far. That's not even a question. But, he's being put in these situations where you could get MVP moments. So I'm not going to discredit that. He earned it. He worked for it. But we talk about player efficiency rating, and I always thought that Jokic, I'm not like a Nuggets fan. I always think that Jokic fans that argue the PER is the biggest deal are stupid anyways. So, it doesn't even matter who finishes first for that, in my opinion. My thing that I do care about when it comes to advanced stats nerds are the usage rate. I know Embiid is putting up a lot of great numbers, but he's the third most used, usage rate player in the whole league. Jokic is 40th. So I guess my point in with that is that whether you want to look at shot attempts or time with the ball or whatever you want to look at, with the usage rate, Jokic is far above Jokic. Or sorry, Embiid is far above Jokic. I'm stuttering over my own words. Point is, Embiid is given the ball more often, if we can be honest. Embiid is on the court more often than Jokic. So, of course, he's going to have better counting stats to me. But when I look at Jokic's counting stats, I'm still impressed. He's averaging 25, 12, and 10 on some of the greatest efficiency of all time, even though PER, Embiid might have the advantage this year. Jokic shooting 40% from three for a guy who's not respected as a shooter, while still being probably the best passer in the league. I love Halliburton. I'd still put Jokic ahead of him. And one thing that we talked about last episode, and we talked about off air many times, Jokic is a much better rebounder than Embiid. Like, I just want to highlight this. We see a 2 rebound difference, and you go, oh, that's not really a big deal. The gap between Jokic and Embiid is the same as Embiid and Jalen Duran, Kayvon Looney, and Luka Doncic. That's quite a big gap at rebounding, especially as you go to the top. Say what you will, but it's also not like Embiid is having many rebounds stolen from him either. I think Jokic makes a point. He has second chance offensive plays. Jokic, whether the PR says, whatever it is, Jokic efficiently puts up insane stat lines on a team that I think is the finals favorite. I know you have some cooked up because you're smiling. I want to hear your point before I dig myself in a hole. I want to see what you have to say.
Well, it just seems like you're completely throwing out the PER thing, and that's been Jokic's whole thing, is he's the PER guy.
That's not been my whole thing, though.
I know it may not be yours, but that's his thing.
No, but I'm making a point not to pull up Raptor or LeBron, all these like advanced
I could
stats that
I could pull up Dylan Brooks. What does he got to do with it? What does LeBron have to do with anything?
no, I mean the stat LeBron, whatever it stands
Why do we
for.
need to pull out a calculator when they're playing basketball?
That's what I'm saying. And so I'm not pulling up calculators. I'm telling you, if we can do eye test all you want, I'm the eye test guy because I vouch for Kobe. Embiid puts up a shit ton of points on a really good team. He passes the eye test, don't get me wrong. But Jokic does everything on a team. I know Embiid can pass. I know he can rebound. Then remember, this argument can't be I think one is good and I think the other's bad. I really
Oh yeah,
do.
I mean we're
Yeah.
we're arguing because it's so close.
Yeah, because they're both so good. It just comes down to the fact that all the criticisms that people have of Jokic are either just to argue for another guy, whether it be Embiid or Giannis, or because they don't like him. If I can be honest, there's not really a hole in Jokic's game, and I will admit that his defense is worse than Embiid's. That's not a problem to me. But the problems that people have with Jokic's defense, and we talked about this off air, come a lot from other defensive players on the Nuggets. One thing the Nuggets struggle with on a team that I find pretty good defensively is they let straight line drives all the time. Say what you will about Harden. I don't think he's a great defender. Like clearly that used to be a meme or whatever. But he doesn't let dudes go straight by him in the same way that a guy like Jamal Murray would. And I think that comes from the fact that Harden is bigger than Jamal Murray. Whatever it is, Jokic is getting dudes straight line driving ready to dunk on his head. He's not going to have a stop every possession, but he's also not getting embarrassed. So I really am like, I know Embiid is great. I just struggle to find a hole in Jokic's game. He's got the passing, he's got the scoring, he's got the rebounding. He's efficient. Even though statistically Embiid is more efficient. I don't see what he's not done. You always say, what else does Embiid have to prove? What does Jokic have to do at this point? He's doing everything.
I think Embiid is doing more things better. I think he's a better scorer by a good amount. Whether that's because Jokic doesn't choose to score or not, I'm not gonna. I think we've had this conversation. We can't knock Embiid for shooting more, and we can't knock Jokic for passing more. But I think Embiid's the best scorer in the league, and I think he's a lot better defender. And I think the gap between their passing and their rebounding, the passing is a lot bigger than the rebounding.
Yeah, but what I'll say is that, if you say Embiid is one of the best, Embiid is the best scorer. I'm not trying to argue around that. Embiid is the best scorer in the league right now, and he's one of the best defenders. I'm going to tell you, Jokic is the best passer and probably the best rebounder. He's second in rebounds right now behind, I believe, Sabonis. You could argue that either way. I'd still put Jokic at number one. He's putting up, and so I'm just going to throw it out there: best rebounder in the league, best passer in the league. He's still putting up an efficient 25 outside of that on a team that is probably still my finals favorites at this point. And he's shooting 40% from three, which I know I brought that up already, but that's astonishing to me because everyone knows Jokic can shoot, but that is, that's elite level shooting, I'll admit, on less attempts. They're the first seed in the West. And I just want to bring up a guy that already won MVP. We see Russell Westbrook, and he was putting up more points in the triple-double, but he averages a triple-double, and that's all anyone talks about. By the end of this year, Jokic probably will average the triple-double. As we record this, I think he's at 9.9 assists technically. Like, it's right there. I'm pretty confident he'll end the season with a triple-double. And that was all Westbrook needed to win the MVP. If we're honest, Harden was a better scorer than Westbrook that year. Harden did different things, and Harden's team was quite a bit better. But Westbrook had a triple-double. He got it easy. Why does that change because we're bored? If averaging a triple-double is one of the biggest feats in NBA history and wins people triple-doubles automatically, why is that different now? I don't understand it. I think the narrative is changing because the Sixers are really hot and Embiid, deservingly is getting praised because they've had a really good stretch and the Nuggets have been average. If the Nuggets go on another winning streak, are we going to start putting Jokic back on top, or is this the media's perfect chance to bury Jokic now? Because I think they're literally running out of things to complain about Jokic for. So the Nuggets going 5-5 was the perfect chance.
Well, I mean, in some of those games, Jokic lost the game. They played against the Knicks, misses 3 wide open shots, and turns the ball over twice. He loses the game for them.
He doesn't lose. I'm gonna tell you who was. Let me pull up that game right now. I can tell you. I watched this game, but I want to be knowledgeable before I speak and say
He
something
missed
stupid.
3 wide open threes.
I understand what you're saying, but does he let Jalen Brunson put up 24 and RJ Barrett put up 21? Like, that's what I'm saying. I have more problems with. Geez, I'm losing you on the screen here. I have more problems with some of the other Nuggets in these situations. Like, it's strange to me how someone puts up 24, 10, and 8 and plays good defense the whole game and they lose them the game. I understand he was not clutch in that game. That is undebatable. But they shouldn't even be in that position. If you're the Nuggets, you should wash the Knicks easy. And you're having dudes, that are meant to guard up doing nothing. And people are going to blame that on Jokic. People are going to blame that, it is strange to me how just a couple years ago, I'm going to bring up Westbrook again. We had an MVP who was on a 60 seed in the West, but now the MVP race is so close. We're bringing up late season East versus West matchups where a player lost by 2, and that's a difference maker in the MVP race. Like, we had an MVP just a couple years ago. That team barely made the playoffs. It is just strange to me, and I feel like, while Embiid, I'm going to say Embiid deserves the MVP too. I think both of them realistically have played good enough to deserve the MVP. I feel like I'm still hearing made up reasons why Jokic doesn't deserve it. If you're going to tell me that a Knicks game against the Nuggets that happened on March 18th is the reason he's not the MVP, then I'm pretty confident in my opinion.
I think I think we're just ignoring the fact that Embiid is having one of the greatest scoring seasons of all time. I know the triple double thing is historic, but Embiid is having the greatest scoring season from a big man and greater season than he's having, I think, the 3rd or the 4th greatest shooting season of all time scoring wise. And he's up there with guys like Kobe and Michael Jordan. And this from a center, this has never happened before.
No, ever. And I respect that a lot, but when Kobe has these incredible scoring seasons, he walks away from his career with 1 MVP. If we're talking about the best scoring seasons ever should get MVPs, that hasn't been what's happened. And whether that's fair or not, I would even hop on your side for a second here and say that's not fair. You don't win the MVP for being the best scorer, or maybe you do. I think we argue this so much because we don't know what the MVP means anymore. If we already knew who would win the MVP right now, this wouldn't even be a segment. With that being said, what I've seen in history, and this is bound to change, is that if you are able to average a triple double, you should win the MVP anyways, because it happened with Westbrook. If your team is the finals favorites while you're averaging a triple double efficiently, unlike Westbrook's, I think the writing's on the wall. I think Jokic just deserves it. I can't lie and say I don't understand the Embiid stuff. He's an incredible player, and the Sixers are winning. But I'm just going to say it one more time. I mean, what else would Jokic have to do here? Would he have to put up 35, 12, and 10? Because if that's the case, then we're at a point where people are so bored of Jokic being the MVP that they want him to do stuff that's never been done before. Like, people want him to put up Wilt Chamberlain numbers. Like, he doesn't. I don't know. I think people expect Jokic to, rival best seasons of all time instead of rivaling the other players in the league. And, I think Embiid's having a great year. You couldn't tell me Embiid's having one of the best seasons of all time.
I mean, if we're looking at history, the most efficient player wins MVP the past 10 years too. And Embiid's the most efficient player in the league.
That's no way Westbrook was the most efficient player when he won the MVP.
The most efficient player wins the MVP.
Hey, if the most efficient player wins the MVP every single year, then we don't even need to have this conversation. But with that being said, I feel like we were just up here saying how the PER was something that Jokic fans were using. If PER is what sells the MVP for you,
well, I'm using it now.
Yeah, but I'm not going to argue with you on it. But, there's a sizable gap in between their stats at everything except for scoring to me. Like, sizable. I already mentioned it earlier, but if the difference between rebounding, it's not some little thing to me. I think rebounding is one of the most important parts of basketball. And they have a difference bigger than the difference between Embiid and Looney. Like, that's what I'm saying. I'm pulling up random people here. It's just like it's I don't know. Banning, if I can be honest with you, I think Jokic has proved it. I think he has the stats. If the Nuggets continue to go on a losing streak and end up falling out of that number one seed, then I could see people talking. But Embiid is, the best player on the best team, which some people use as an argument. And he leads, if he's leads or second in the league at rebounding and assists while being a center. We talk about Embiid having a historic season because he's leading the league in scoring as a center. Jokic is rebounding like some of the best centers ever and passing like he's the best point guard in the league while dropping an efficient 25 on the best team in the West while being a center. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
I mean, I think the gap between them defensively is bigger than you're kind of playing it out to be. Jokic isn't a top 50 defender statistically.
Yeah, and you know what? I have my feelings here, and we've talked about this off air as well.
He just stands there and waits for the rebound. That's how the rebound. He has guys run past him, and Embiid is in the same situation. Harden and Maxey are not good defenders. He gets as many runs to the rim as Jokic gets per game too. And this also brings me into the point that the Nuggets former head coach trying to get his propaganda out here that Embiid takes possessions off and has his lazy body language. If you've watched any game this year, I can see if you say that a few years ago, but now if you're going to say a guy that takes possessions off and we're comparing Embiid and Jokic, I think Jokic takes more possessions off than Embiid, but he's not going to admit that.
We have the George Karl statement in our notes, and underneath I wrote stupid and wrong. I'm not going to use that to my advantage at all. It's a stupid and incorrect statement. With that being said, I will agree there's a defensive gap, and that's fine by me. I'm not going to try to sit here and argue that Jokic is a better defender than Embiid because I'd probably shoot myself because there's no way you could argue that. With that being said, you could call it a gap, but this might just be, maybe I'll throw my 2 cents in here and, you can agree with this or disagree, and anyone watching can agree or disagree. I think defensive efficiency stats are so plain out because I'm going to ask you this. Is Gobert one of the best defenders of all time? No, not even close. Did he win Defensive Players of the Year because he was efficiently one of the best defensive players of all time based on stats? Yes. I don't think it speaks volumes to defense, especially when we're going down the board a little bit to guys like Embiid and Jokic. I think it's easy to argue that Embiid is a better defender, but I'm not going to let efficiency stats tell me that's why he should be the MVP. Once again, if Embiid is the MVP over Jokic because he is a pretty marginally better defensive efficiency player, I just don't see that.
Well, I don't even think it's just efficiency. I think it's just overall.
When I know
statistically or not statistically, eye test or not, he's a better defensive player. He's one of the best rim protectors in the league.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's tough. I'm one of the best rim defenders in the league. He's up there. I'm not going to sit on that one too much. But with that being said,
I mean, he's almost averaging 2 blocks a game.
Yeah, but okay. I like what you're saying, but at the end of the day, this isn't selling me on the MVP either. Because I mean, defense is obviously critically important, but it's not like we're talking about Giannis here. This is an argument I could see Giannis fans using because Giannis actually is probably the best defender in the whole league. That's a real argument here. We're comparing pretty good defender and average defender. Whatever. We're talking about the MVP. Yes, Jokic is an average defender. He used to be below average. People still like to throw shade at him like he hasn't gotten better. Sure, average defender, really good scorer, best passer, best rebounder. That sells it for me. And I will tell you this, Jokic is best scorer, pretty good defender, pretty good rebounder for his position, pretty good passer. And I'm not trying to throw shade at Embiid. He's really good. That's why we sit here and fight about it. But I mean, I don't even know what other points I have to bring up. I'm sick of talking about how he can shoot threes. I'm sick of talking about how he's averaging a friggin' triple double. How is that not a big deal?
Well, if he doesn't end up with a triple double, though, what happens?
We'll see what happens when it happens. But with that being said, I mean, I'm not going to bank on him not getting a triple double when he's at 25, 12, and 9.9.
I mean, I want to keep it fair here too, because I think if he's at 9.9, I personally, I mean, that's a triple double. But also, if we go back in history, if Russell Westbrook's at 9.9, do you think people are going to say he averaged a triple double? Statistically, in the books, he doesn't.
No, and I totally agree with that. But was he going to win the MVP anyway? Yes.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'm saying. I mean, personally, I'm not. I like Jokic clearly as I'm sitting here defending him. It's not like he's my favorite player or anything either. Like I don't need him to average the triple double. I don't really care that much. But I think the point of Westbrook averaging the triple double and winning the MVP was clearly that's enough statistically to show people that you deserve it. You know, whether Jokic is within that or not, in that range, Westbrook would have got it anyways too. I guess that's what I'm saying.
I mean, but he had 3 years where he averaged was triple double. He didn't win MVP every year though. So it's not an automatic triple double wins MVP. That's
No,
what I'm saying in this scenario too.
no, and I understand that, but I think that was maybe this is me diminishing Westbrook more than anything. That was really Westbrook's only argument over Harden that year, and it was good enough. I think that was one of the tightest MVP races we've seen in a long time. And since Westbrook averaged a triple double, he got the nod almost. That was a pretty big ad for him. And when we see an MVP race this year where Jokic and Embiid are so close, if Jokic averages that triple double and stays on the first seed in the West, those are just adding on to his resume. When people act like those are the only two reasons that he should be the MVP, I disagree. I'm not telling you that. But you look at the stats, you look at how the team has played. If you also add on, oh yeah, average a triple double and first seed in the West, I can't. And I'll sit here and I'll tell you the truth. I'm gonna fight for Jokic just because like this is what we've already been doing. But if the Nuggets lose their first seed, Jokic doesn't get the triple double, and then Embiid keeps tearing stuff up, I'll admit it to Embiid. I don't have a problem doing that. Like it's not my end all be all. But just looking at what we have now, I can't say it's not Jokic. I really can't.
I mean, we can compare this to the 2017-2018 season where Russell Westbrook averaging the triple double, James Harden leading scorer, averaging one of the best scoring seasons of all time. That's pretty much what's happening right now, except Embiid is doing it as a center with a lot more rebounds.
Well, to be fair, Jokic is doing it as a center as well. You know, it's
yeah.
I mean, we're comparing two guards to two centers. I think both, and this might be a hot take, I think Jokic's and Embiid seasons are both more impressive than both of those seasons, just because of the positional value. So, I mean, I don't want to screw up the positions too much because either way, we could flip this in our favor. It's way more impressive that Embiid is scoring that much as a center. It's also way more impressive that Jokic is putting up that many assists as a center. So it could go both ways.
I mean, I think it's going to be close until the end of the season, but I think for now, I just want to ask you, what does Embiid have to do in these next few weeks kind of to solidify it for you, if he could?
No. And
is there anything?
I think Embiid just has to keep playing at this level because we've seen Embiid plays at the level he's at right now, and he's closed the gap with Jokic. He's the odds-on favorite, right? If Embiid keeps doing this, I'm running out of reasons. But I just anticipate Jokic to, you know, I think the Nuggets are going to go back to their winning ways. You know, they're not necessarily losing, but I think they're going to come back. And if they finish first in the West, Jokic does get that triple double. Again, not the end all be all for me, but just adds frosting to the cake. Then I think it's Jokic's, you know, it's his in the bag. But if Embiid can keep this up.
Well, the thing is, though, with the winning, you did say last week that winning doesn't play a factor into it. And when Embiid was on the number one team in the East and Jokic was 6th, it didn't matter then. So how much does winning really matter?
Yeah, but again, I hate to break down the history, and we're talking a lot about Westbrook and Harden. Harden was the first seed in the West. Westbrook was the 6th. You know, there's history that plays into me having these opinions. So I'm not saying that the best player on the best team wins the MVP. I just think that so happens to be Jokic in this scenario, along with all the other reasons. So to go back to your original question, I don't want to dodge it. I want to be as honest as possible. If Embiid keeps up the stretch that he's been on, I'll come on here and tell you I think Embiid's the MVP. But it's not that I think it's unattainable because he's proven he can do it, but it's a really hot streak. So if he keeps that up, I'm gonna sit here and shut my mouth and admit defeat. But just with the way that things are looking right now, I still have to go Jokic. What do you think Jokic could do to prove it for you?
I think he's just the winning. It's interesting for me because right now, as we're sitting here, the Sixers have a better record, but they're
Yeah,
third
yeah.
in the East. And like if we're comparing the Nuggets and the Sixers, if you put the Sixers in the West right now, they would be first. So if you're comparing the Nuggets being first in the West to the Sixers, if they have the same record, which they basically have the same record right now, the
Yeah, but
you can't blame the Sixers.
we talked about this earlier though. The West is so tight and the East is top heavy. And I've mentioned this before and we kind of agreed on this. You can't just put teams in other conferences. They don't play other conferences. If the Sixers had to play more of those playoff teams in the West, they'd still be
No, but
really good. But
record wise, they would be first in the West.
yeah, but you can't just put them in the West.
But if the Sixers end with a better record and Embiid wins more games, but they're not the number one seed, but the Nuggets are the one seed, I don't think that's really that much more of an argument for
No,
Jokic.
no, I agree, man. That's something I wouldn't give Jokic at that point. It's not my only reason either. But I project, and this is just me looking forward because we're not at the end of the season yet. I'm projecting the Nuggets to have more wins and be first in the West.
I think if they have more wins and they're first in the West and I don't think Jokic needs to play better necessarily to be my MVP. I just think I think the only way for me right now for him to win is if Embiid starts to slow down and he starts to pick up. I think
I
I said it before, it's Embiid's award to lose at this point.
Yeah, I think we both just said in ways dancing around the question that I don't think Jokic can lose it. You don't think Embiid can lose it. You just think the other one can screw up.
Yeah.
And
I think that's
and
pretty much it.
yeah, I think as long as we admit that, I'm fine putting it on the record.
We'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, we're probably going to talk about this every week until the season's over. And, I'm willing to come up here and say my opinions can change. If Jokic starts struggling and the Nuggets do in turn, and some of these, stats that I really love about him start to, wander off, then it's not going to be difficult for me to say Embiid is an MVP caliber player because he's the favorite for a reason. I'm not acknowledging, or I'm not, gonna not acknowledge that.
I think, just a closing thought. I think if Embiid keeps on this streak for the end of the season, especially with the hardest strength of schedule remaining with 11 games left,
Yeah.
I don't think you can give it to him. But
No,
with the
I'll agree
strength
with
of
that.
schedule, we could see it drop a little bit. But
Yeah, and that's
11 games left, and by the time we come out with this, probably 10. So we'll probably talk about this for 2 more weeks. And by the time we come back in 2 weeks, we'll both have a definitive one if it's the same person it is. If it's not, then we'll have an argument for it.
yeah, and the worst thing that you could possibly hear from your favorite sports podcast is we'll wait and see because that's a cop out. But in this case, we gave you our thoughts today. We're gonna have to wait and see how those change or stay the same.
Yeah. So just like last week, probably the longest segment of the episode. That's just how it has been, just because it's so close. We wouldn't have the argument if it wasn't close. These are the top 2 guys in the league right now. And I want to bring in Giannis for a second. He is having a really good year, but you're comparing it to a historic triple-double season and a historic scoring season. And
Yeah.
Giannis he's obviously the third highest odds for a reason, but unless he starts dropping 40 every single game, I don't think he inserts himself into the top 2 conversation.
Yeah, and just to bounce off exactly what you just said, we mentioned his availability earlier. That's not helping his case. Obviously, it's not a huge knock on him, but if you're not playing in these games to end out the year, and Jokic and Embiid are fighting and carrying teams, you're in different playing fields to me.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty much it for this episode. We'll be back next week to probably just talk about this topic the whole time.
Yep.
I'm sure a few other things will happen, but we'll breeze over those real quick.
All right.
So we'll see you
Perfect.
guys. We'll see you guys next week.
All right. Thank you, guys.